It's really a delight to be here. I've really enjoyed the sessions that I've sat in on before. And while my area of expertise is drug pricing, I've been doing it about 20 years. It has only become sexy in the last couple, so I'm kind of excited about that. Otherwise, it's a little bit of a arcane tax-like backwater at most companies, but it's clearly central to the cures discussion. So that is a topic we're going to lead off on. But before we do that, I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves. Eric?
So I'm Eric Aguiar. I'm a partner at Aisling Capital, which is a venture capital firm that is based in Manhattan. We nominally run about $1.7 billion and mostly do therapeutics investments, clinical stage and beyond.
I'm Philippe Lopes-Fernandes. I'm heading global licensing, business development, alliance management for Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. I need to say all that because I need to differentiate from our ex-subsidiary, Merck & Co., which became an independent company in 1917. But we share the same name, except in the US and Canada, we're known as EMD Serono, and outside the US and Canada, we're Merck.
I'm Cami Samuels. I'm a partner at Venrock. Venrock's been around for 50 years. It was originally the venture arm of the Rockefeller family. Today, 10% of our money comes from the Rockefellers, and otherwise, I don't even know that it's many billions of dollars under management. And my focus is on therapeutics, and we love investing in early stage companies. So just because we have a lot of money under management does not mean we're not interested in the young startups. We seed companies with as little as $250,000. I've been in the venture business for going on 18 years now. I like to say that I started when I was out of high school, but that's not the case. And looking forward to hearing your questions.
Great. I'm Bob Ward. I'm the chairman and CEO of Elox Pharmaceuticals. We're an emerging biotechnology company focusing on translational read-through drugs for rare and ultra-rare genetic disorders. I think the cures discussion is particularly timely with Spark's approval so recent and pricing. That I think on everyone's mind is the question of, as we think about curing areas of high unmet medical need, how will we pay for it? Who can access it? So it's a perfect time to be talking about it.
Thanks, Bob. So what I thought I'd do is tell you the 4 topic areas we're going to try to get to today, and then hopefully leave some room for questions. First, we're going to tackle the pricing discussion. How are cures impacting the pricing debate? How do you justify these prices? How do you land on these prices? Then we're going to talk about how it changes the timing and nature of discussions with payers. How are cures different in how you go about talking to payers about coverage and reimbursement for the product? Then we're going to talk about how cures might be different for the investment decisions. How does it change the timing, nature, issues that you talk about there? And last but not least, with the focus on coverage and reimbursement, are we starting to see enough critical mass with these acceleration of cures coming to market that we really are going to see driving change in the payer market in a way that maybe was kickstarted with the discussions around single market with Sovaldi, but really haven't seen traction. So that's what we're going to try to do with my panelists sort of feeding in that information as we go. And we do hope to have some questions, so please feed those in as we talk. So topic number 1 is pricing. The pricing debate to date has largely been about a couple of things. One is price increases that outpace inflation, so that you have mature products that have had prices that are now multiples of their launch price because of those price increases. We've also seen debate about competing therapies that have parallel price increases in the market. And is there collusion, or is that, more nefariously, but just generally seeing competing products with those same multiple price increases? With the launch of cures in the market recently with Kymriah, with Luxturna, with the Kite product, with very significant price tags, there certainly is discussion around, boy, it's a lot of money. But it seems to me that it's a slightly different discussion because it's a different issue. And so I wanted the panel to start talking about what is the debate now about cures pricing. And I think I'm going to start with maybe Bob on the folks that are in manufacturers, and then ask the investment bankers and the VCs to chime in.
No, I think it's a hot topic. If you think of one of the disease areas that we're interested in is cystinosis. So this would be a genetic disorder where through a lifetime, patients accumulate damage from having a defective transporter lysosomal protein. So if it's a 6-month-old child and you intervene, then that child avoids a lifetime of damage. If you talk about someone who's older and has already accumulated the impact of the disease and you intervene to stabilize the disease, it's not possible to reverse the disease, even if at that point you halt progression. So if you think of our development program, you can't go to kids till you've shown it in adults. So now suddenly, here's a disease state where we could be disease modifying, but the development paradigm says, let's, with our eye towards safety, take a prudent step of going to a patient population that would be disease stabilization and not necessary modification. So if you said the initial pricing discussion would be in a therapeutic area where you are stabilizing patients, and then as you continue to advance the program, you get closer and closer to the area of cures. The pricing question becomes different based on the health economics outcome. For those young children facing potential kidney transplants, many of the older adults would already have had kidney transplants. We already had the case study with Sovaldi. Avoid liver transplantation with fantastic therapeutic innovation that led to a cure of an infectious disease. High societal interest. When you can catch it from someone else, it's a societal problem. When you can make it go away and avoid expensive transplantation, that's a great health economic story, tremendous value creation through innovation. But the dollar number, the price tag, obscured the value. So it's really two things. How in the development process can we make sure that we have the ability to continue to advance to where we be disease modifying? Does that mean the price changes then when we're disease stabilizing? And also, how in the conversation of pricing can you make sure it's value that's discussed as opposed to the price tag? So just back to Spark for a moment. Many of you who are engaging with payers like Express Scripts may be dreading that pricing interaction. Well, remember, Steve Miller said the $850,000 price tag was responsible because they engaged with the payer to say, how will we provide patients access? How will we deliver? And so pricing is no longer the dollar figure. It's who have you engaged and what is the health outcome now that you've tied it to.
What's interesting about what you just said, Bob, is a lot of people think about indication-based pricing. And having the same product and having it have two different uses for two different indications, so two different price points. In your example, it's the same drug, same indication, just two different periods of life. And we can't even do indication-based pricing. How can we have differential pricing based on impact and stage of life? And so we haven't. That's a good question.
Well, we're fortunate in the rare and ultra rare, there are some incentives that help offset some of the risks and are so important for why drugs are being developed. But in other indications that may not be rare or ultra rare, the question is, if you want to deliver the cure, how do we make sure that the incentives in the development pathway supports it as well?
So one of the things, and forgive me, because you had said you wanted the industrial person to go, but I never follow rules. So one of the things, joking, one of the things that I think about is a one-time therapy. And historically, we have struggled as an industry, for instance, with antibiotics, one-time therapy, hopefully, usually, to turn that into a really profitable business. And so these cures that most of us in the pharmaceutical industry got into the business to participate in what's happening, to finally actually address diseases in a fundamental way. And yet the business of a cure doesn't have, I was always taught as a venture capitalist, you're looking for an annuity. The business of a cure does not have the same compelling business model as an annuity. Lipitor was an annuity. So that is the strategic issue that we think about a lot. Now, having said that, we're investors in Regenix, Avexis, Audentes. We have really embraced gene therapy because it's so clinically important. But there are real commercial issues that it feels like at this point we, as an industry, are letting individual companies start to solve it for us as opposed to coming to collective solutions.
Yeah, I actually do think it'll be interesting to see if there are lessons to be learned from the antibiotic pricing and development debate or whatever we're dealing with now, or likewise, whether they're going to learn from whatever happens with cures for a bigger disease
Higher
states.
value
Yes,
antibiotics. Yep.
Absolutely. Philippe?
Of course, we all want to maximize the proceed for our investments. So it's clear that we are going to try to find ways to motivate our investor to put the money at risk that we need to put to develop these compounds, and yet have something that is going to be a price that makes sense for also the patients at the end of the day. Right now what we have is not a cure, but we just launched a product in Europe that was approved in September last year in Germany, and it's a product targeting MS patients, and the posology is very simple. It's 10 tablets year one, for during 2 weeks, 10 tablets year two, and you have 4 years efficacy. How do you price that? And it's tablets. So it's not a CAR T, it's not the complexity of, it's not the gene therapy, and yet, 4 years efficacy. So how to factor that, and we had very interesting discussions with the payer on that. So, I think there's going to be a lot of things, and we now have the other.
Well, what's interesting, Philippe, about that is that in Europe it might even be easier because it's a single payer. Single payer. It's even more difficult when the year 3 and 4, where no one has to pay for it, it's a different payer altogether.
Yeah. The difficulty is, in Europe, that the price you start with is never going to be the maximum. It's the maximum price. It goes down after that. So.
Eric?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. So the good news is innovation is moving along quite nicely in our society, and it's working out. The model is working quite well from an innovation and treating patient side. When I was a medical resident back in the late 80s, early 90s, if you had metastatic lung cancer, maybe you lived 6 years, and it was a tough, 6 months, excuse me, not 6 years. And it was a very tough 6 months. Now, if you have the right markers, you might be making several years. So these innovations really do make a difference. CAR T, right? These are people that might be passing away and are cured or live a long time. Spark was mentioned. You can't see, and now you can in a functional facet. So I think all of society sort of agrees with the innovation side. And there was an interesting New York Times article on Sunday about even both sides of the aisle agree on innovation is a good thing. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, the pricing, the economics, who pays, who benefits, is there ration, et cetera. These are very, obviously complicated questions. And I think that, years ago I helped Kaiser out in between jobs on something, and, they would fight for 4 cents on a statin, but they would let lysosomal storage diseases price a little bit, with a lot of freedom. And part of that is the number of patients times the revenue was a budget hit versus the small number of patients times big. So I think that with the innovation and the cures and the orphans, you're coming with these very high price tags. So I just did a quick count prior to this talk. In the last 6 months, we've had 3 companies come into our shop arguing that they will price between $1 million and $2 million for a therapy. So that, brings up a whole lot of different issues. My sense is that, there's going to be some brand new, haven't thought of models coming out, whether it's, the GE finance capital, Cammie's point, turning one injection into an annuity by financing it over 20 years with an interest rate, or it's, more of the government, one payer type models. But, it's complicated who pays and over what time they pay and what benefits those payers get. But my sense is we'll work this out in a way that's positive for society. It's sort of the old Shakespearean love quote, things will work out in the end, they always do. I just don't think we have yet, and it's going to take some creativity.
And I think we'll get there, well, at least we'll start talking about that a little bit more explicitly later in the panel. But Pascal, you've joined us, so if you want to introduce yourself, but since you've lived pricing a cure, I don't know if there's anything that you're willing to share with the audience.
Yeah, sorry. First of all, sorry for being late. I apologize for that. I'm the head of cell and gene therapy at Novartis Oncology, and as you may have heard, we've recently got approval and launched Kymriah in the US, which was the first CAR T therapy available and registered in the US and in the world, in fact. And this has been an amazing experience over the last few months to be able to get approval of something that is so new. It's not only that it's a transformative therapy. We are very cautious right now not to talk about a cure yet because we don't have enough type of data to talk about cure, but it's certainly a transformative therapy with 83% complete response or complete response with incomplete blood count in kids with relapsed refractory pediatric ALL. So when you reach that type of level of complete response, and these are sustained complete response for most of them, you have a transformative therapy. And when you have a transformative therapy, which is a one-off therapy, you of course have to think how you're going to not only price it, but organize the access to the therapy. Because pricing is just an aspect there that has to be taken into account. But the key is how do you get access to that therapy to as many patients as possible. And we've worked a lot in advance of this particular approval, not only internally, not only with typical experts in the pharmacoeconomic type of field, where we could work with them and demonstrate cost effectiveness. But cost effectiveness is just one part, and you might have discussed that, one part of the discussion there. And this therapy at the price of $475,000 is indeed cost effective. In fact, the cost effectiveness price will have been around $650 or even $700, depending on the scenarios there. So we priced at a lower level than the cost effectiveness price. That was a decision done on purpose by our top management to make sure that we find a way that is reasonable with this type of transformative one-off therapy there. So cost effectiveness was work done in advance, based on the results of the studies. And then there was a lot of work done with various payers, both private and public, and to make sure that we engage very early on with CMS in particular on what type of consequences these therapies could have on their particular aspect of healthcare funding. And this led to a lot of good and constructive discussion with them that allowed us to have some agreements and some discussion leading to not only an idea of moving progressively, ideally, towards an indication-based pricing in the US, which is not happening right now today, and it's moving on to that directions, but also to work on outcome-based contracting. And the outcome-based contracting is something that is very, very important for Novartis. As you may know, we have done that with other type of drugs like Entresto in heart failure, like Tasigna in CML. We've tried to engage with many pricing authorities worldwide on the idea to find a reasonable outcome that is really shared between the payers, the providers, and ourselves, and can we commit to that outcome and what type of impact this commitment will have in terms of pricing and reimbursement there. So we managed to move into this type of situation with CMS, and we are now progressively putting in place an outcome-based contracting for Kymriah, where the institutions or the sites or the hospitals that wants to partner with us there will be billed only if there is a complete response at 1 month, which is a very strong commitment on the part of Novartis into making sure that the results from a clinical study are being translated into the real world and can bring the benefit that we want to bring to the patients, to the medical community, to the institutional healthcare system, and to society. So that has been very important for us to come back to that, about not only demonstrating the value of that particular one-off therapy, but also finding a way to manage access for patients. And demonstrating the value was around cost effectiveness, but also the different pillars of value that I mentioned. Obtaining a right type of agreements and discussion with key players there to manage access was extremely important. And so far, we've been able to manage access for that drugs in the US, or that therapy in the US. I don't even know whether we could call that a drug. And that's very good for those patients that can benefit from it.
And so far, you've not had, you've not seen an outcry in the press about the price, which is also probably a good signal that you've done the right steps to explain and that it's not seen as outrageous as we had seen with Sovaldi a few years ago. So that's also an interesting point.
I'm going to give a Sovaldi anecdote that I found amusing. So a few years, when Sovaldi and Harvoni were taking their bolus through the payer system in the U.S. I spoke to an old business school friend who's a CMO at a small payer, a small health insurer in New England area. And he literally said to me, by the way, I was talking to him because I was doing diligence on one of our gene therapy companies and thinking about price. And he said, Cammie, we're losing $24 million this year as a result of Harvoni and Sovaldi, and we're the most profitable payer in New England. So for a brief period of time, those drugs, as we know, we heard people squawking about it, created a real problem. And so one of the things I find really interesting, for instance, outcomes-based pricing has come up relative to these cures, but that's not what makes cures unique. What makes cures unique is this one-time component. We've always, as an industry, had some patients who are responders and non-responders. We've always had expensive drugs, not this expensive, but now we are coming to this outcomes-based pricing. Spark's doing it too. But that's not really solving the biggest issue, the annuity problem, the business model issue, the annuity problem. And I'm curious as to why the outcomes pace is coming up now. Maybe you know, Alice.
I think it just goes with the price tag. It's a response. It is a response to the complaints about the price is fine. Don't pay for it if it doesn't work. I think one of the unique things about Kymriah that on outcomes that matters is you can measure the outcome at 30 days. So you only have to wait 30 days to get paid. Not everyone's going to be able to measure and have that clear of a measurement at 30 days, and I think it's a nice, convenient, fortuitous result that probably helped make that an easier model to implement for the company.
Certainly, and I think we've been very clear since the beginning that every therapy, every indication will lead to a different type of outcome that is expected, and possibly to a different type of outcome-based pricing. So it's very therapy and indication-based, and in an environment of today, when you have standard of care of today. So all that will evolve with time.
Well, I think one of the things Eric mentioned earlier was this question of will there be a different financing mechanism? And I think we hinted about this with annuities. We have to remember right now for healthcare, we're still skewed towards delivering healthcare to elderly individuals. And we're skewed away from delivering healthcare to women of childbearing potential or young children. So if you ask the question with an expensive therapy that's going to be amortized over the individual's lifespan, clearly with younger individuals, cures are much more affordable. So one of the things that will be really interesting to see is if our industry now finds itself having to rotate towards diseases that affect younger individuals. We have a very heavy investment in oncology right now, except pediatric oncology. For kids that survive pediatric oncology, they go on to live a normal lifespan because it's either mortality or survival at a young age. So part of us being able to capture the value of the cure is being able to communicate from a societal perspective why are the things that we're producing have value to society. There's probably a whole group of folks still paying off their student loans because as society, we said education was an investment we want to make in young people because there's a return for their entire life, and student loans are an amortization method that enables them to afford that period early in advance of income and be able to undertake it because it's societally necessary. So as we think about novel pricing or different ways of working with payers, I think the next question is going to be, what is the age of the individual that you're intervening on? And this concept of the cure, are you reversing age-related decline? Are you changing a lifelong commitment? And what is the period of time where the patient could benefit from that outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fascinating because the accounting is kind of subjective and very difficult. So, Cammie, to your point on how much money they were, losing on Sovaldi. I mean, how much were they losing on hepatitis before Sovaldi, right? So
but the problem is that two issues, right?
How they account
that
for it, yeah.
projected over a period of time
Right.
versus one time,
Right.
and then they only own that patient for a
Right.
year and a half,
That's-
so they don't get the economic benefit.
Yeah.
Which is what
Yeah,
Alice,
but they-
why Alice
but they
brought up
get
single
from
payer
a-
versus
from a different patient that would come to them. So that,
fair enough,
also-
but they don't think about it that way, right?
There was a backlog as well. So that
So,
second
so
time.
the topic that I think we can jump to is people have been talking about single payer and annuity models since Sovaldi for that reason. Nothing's really happened other than people saying it can't happen because our system is too fragmented. We are allergic to single payer systems politically. And the question I have is, with cures and with these single, as we have more of them, because we have 3 or 4 now, certainly 3 if you look at the 2 CAR-Ts and Lopes-Fernandes that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, one time or one course of therapy. And as we expect to see a lot more CAR-Ts, as I was discussing with Philippe before we started, are we going to have a critical mass that forces that change? Not necessarily top-down from the government for all sorts of reasons in terms of political willpower, in terms of lacking the expertise to do it, but are there things like secondary insurers that are going to start doing that to see how it works?
Leading up to this panel, I was thinking about how could I justify being a biotech investor in a drug securitization model, right, to deal with this issue? I think I could. So any entrepreneurs in the audience, I think it's a very interesting issue, right? I mean, you're bringing up an additional subtlety that I frankly hadn't thought about, shame on me, about should you price differentially based on the benefit, and you're bringing up the age of intervention as, we're in Avexis, and Avexis is treating a disease called SMA with gene therapy, and frankly, it's the first time as an investor in my life that I've seen before and after videos and cried, seeing the benefit for these kids. But you need to intervene as young as possible, and it will not be the same benefit if the kid gets it at 2, which is about how old they'd be.
Right, and if you think of the societal benefit of driving economic growth, now you take someone who previously had a limited ability to contribute because of physical limitations or other, and now they're a fully producing member of society. It's great societal value. So if you said as a society, do we have a responsibility to make sure there's access and the ability to afford those types of life transformative medicines? We do. And today it's an area where the industry has tiptoed a little bit. We haven't really jumped in with both feet to say, here are patients without which creating this path, we will not be able to transform their lives in the way that could be. And it is of great societal benefit.
Yeah, maybe to comment on that. First of all what you discuss about the age is already taken into account in any cost effectiveness or pharmacoeconomic analysis. So when you say that something, and I know in the US it's not very popular, and it's considered as something coming from various groups, not something mainstream. In the rest of the world, it's mainstream, at least in Europe there. And when you do cost effectiveness analysis, you take into account the age and the contribution of that particular individual to society in an economic terms. And when you have a drug that is cost effective treating a 70 years old patient, it means it's cost effective. And that means it's really bringing benefit to the system. So the age is something that is taken into account by the analysis. But coming back to the pediatric oncology comment, I don't think that this is an area that is neglected at all. I think it's just extremely complex. And we decided to go ourselves for the pediatric ALL as a first indication because we believe that we could make a significant difference very rapidly in these kids. But if we could have many other type of therapies like that, we'll do it immediately. So it's nothing to do with a view on the market potential or on the visions of not taking care of these kids. It's just that it's extremely complex. And the unfortunate thing in these pediatric oncology cases, they are very, very fast progressing. And you have to treat them with efficient treatment. That's what we're doing there.
So Pascal, right now in the development paradigm, we're limited on our ability to engage with payers in advance of approval. So the data we can share is limited. And if you think of the innovative approach you've taken to outcomes-based pricing, do you think being able to talk with payers at the end of phase 2 and say, based on what we believe could be delivered out of phase 3, this is the type of therapeutic, how would you handle that in your reimbursement system? Would that be a way to help break down a little bit of the pricing barriers?
I think it will be. It's happening in Europe. And as you know, we have the possibility to engage with NICE and other type of bodies much earlier there, even before starting the phase 3. And that's something that is establishing a constructive dialogue. So when you come to these payers, then you have something at least that you've discussed with them. Might not answer all of their requirements but at least you have discussed that with them in advance, so they know, and you have tried to adapt what is your plan to their requirements there. So this will certainly create some positive impact on preparing access. Again, the key is access, and especially when you have this type of cure life-saving therapies, you have so much pressure by definition from the patient, the families, to make sure they get access. So the more you can preempt that and work in advance with the payers and for the payers as well, the better.
Yeah, I would, it's interesting because certainly, as you mentioned, the single-payer system has been anathema politically in America for a while, but so has rationing and not allowing children to get their care or cancer patients to get their CAR-T therapy, et cetera. So, the difficult question is how do you spread the costs of these very effective, innovative therapies across society without a single-payer system? And there may be some solutions.
Well, and that's where I think what we might start seeing is secondary insurers working with payers and saying, we will do that, and we will enroll the different insurers. Because the problem, of course, is everyone has to participate in order for everyone to spread it. They're not necessarily going to do that directly, but if you have secondary insurers that get into the market of taking on that risk, they can, that's one model that occurred to me you could start seeing.
So I'm sorry. No, it's reinsurance for hurricanes and expensive therapies.
That's exactly right.
But should we not consider that the primary insurer should be a single payer instead of, we're trying to think about impact on society and reconcile that with payers that have a quarterly profitability target. That won't work. There's no model where this can work. You could have a single payer system for the primary payer and then have secondary insurers that are private payers. I know that it's difficult. For me as a European, I don't understand why it's a problem. But we don't have a private FDA, per state or whatever. We have one single FDA approval. Why not a single payer?
I was down in a Latin American country where they have a single payer system, and based on the oncology budget annually, by the time they get to the end of the year, if you're under 21, you access chemotherapy. If you're over 21, you're given aspirin until a new budgeting year. So this rationing concept, whenever you come back to single payer, it's based on rationing, which means there's not access for all. So if we're committed to access for all, it has to be that there's multiple access points for patients. And if you think of the areas where access works, patients have access to cures, patient advocacy has been strong. If you think of HIV, patient advocacy changed the development paradigm, meant that drugs got to market faster, meant that people had access to drugs. Patient advocacy will continue to be very important to make sure that people have access so that it is access for all and not a ration-based system where those who can afford it can access it anywhere in the world that it's available, and those who cannot are denied access to care.
See, because I think, Pascal, you're absolutely, I think it's relatively straightforward to see the cost effectiveness of the therapies, the new therapies, at a societal level and certainly at an individual level. So the question becomes, how do you share that burden across more than 37 families, right, or whatever the case may be?
And it's a society decision at the end of the day. Each country is having, we have so many different healthcare systems all over the world that every country has decided. Maybe if you ask people in the country, they say, I didn't decide it myself, but the country, in a way, whatever the system, democracy or whatever, has decided a particular healthcare system and a way to handle these type of situations. Now, the challenge for global companies like ourselves is how do you manage access to all these different systems there? And this has been a challenge from the beginning. I remember still that even before we lost the patent on Gleevec, more than 1/3 of the Gleevec treatment were given free of charge by Novartis through access program, because that was the only way in many of these countries for this patient to get access to the treatment that was a life-saving treatment. Because we talk about cure, but even in CML you cannot say that Gleevec it was or is a cure. It was a possibility to decrease your risk of dying very significantly. And so this responsibility is very much under us in terms of global company to find solutions in a constructive way with the various societies, government, organizations all over the world. And that's extremely complex.
Well, I think one of the key differences is in the European markets where they have single payers, there is a historical single shared culture experience, and I think that makes a huge difference in having shared values that enable single payers in those decisions. In the United States, where we have the opposite of that, particularly at the moment, I just think it becomes much more difficult to have trust in shared decisions about access, about pricing and the like, which is why as I thought about this and talked with you while I'm preparing, I do think there's an interesting possibility for the private payer market to start creating solutions about sharing this risk that could help inform, how does the Medicaid program get the various state programs to buy in so that they do that using the private payer of the market, the different Medicare carriers, Part B carriers for the different regions to start maybe having that secondary as well. But I deal with CMS all the time. I'm not seeing them leading on that. I think that they would probably look to see some pathways created in the private market first.
Well, Alice, I think an interesting area will be to watch what happens in China. So if we said here in the US, a minority of payments are cash payments. In China, most of the payments are cash payments where patients are directly purchasing their own health care. So when you talk about the value of a cure, it's based on willingness to pay. Now here in the US, we do have a very strong established model, which was in the Great Recession of 2008. If you had wrinkles, you would continue to inject to make sure you did not have wrinkles, because Americans will absolutely pay any price to avoid having wrinkles. But when we come to other therapeutic areas, our willingness to pay out of pocket is quite different. So I think with the cure debate, whether it's a country where we have to provide access to medicines on a moral basis without cost because it's economically unaffordable, to a country like China where it is cash pay, and there are patients at every level of the economic strata who can afford to buy products. There are many that access international products preferentially. To a market here where we are very much thinking of insurance first. I pay a copay. I don't want to have to pay an out-of-pocket. I think we'll see a lot of innovation in China that might move at a faster pace than here because of the different structure in the market.
All right, we're going to change gears here for a minute, which is we have a lot of companies with their first products or with their first suite of products who I think are going to be very interested in knowing if they have a cure, how is the investment decision different? Is it earlier? Are there different questions that that you are interested in hearing, whether you're a funder or whether you're a company that's looking to buy? So I'll start with you, Cammie. How is it different for cures?
So of course it is. By definition, this business model issue I've mentioned comes to our mind. Having said that, I also said, so we were Series A investors in Juno, and I mentioned the 3 gene therapy companies. And so we still made the investment. And so in retrospect, and you heard that I called payers and they told me this is really hard with Sovaldi and Harvoni, and yet I did it anyway. So in retrospect, I think in some ways it was a faith-based decision. It was, if you're doing important things for humanity, we will figure out a way to pay for it. Honestly, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, and Avex's stock price is really high, the market seems to think that we will find a way to pay for it. But we don't know for sure how that's going to work. And coming back to this, why isn't it a single payer? This country values liberty over equality big time. And so I have no confidence that we're going to have a single payer system anytime soon. And Bernie Sanders notwithstanding. So I instead actually think that the uniquely American way to solve it is through the entrepreneurial system. So again, any of you out there create this reinsurance business, I'm interested.
Yeah, I think, as the cure, I agree with Cammie, cure makes a huge difference, right? So, the idea that you're the 5th statin and you're going to do really well in today's market is much more challenging than when I started in 92 in this business. When I started in 92 in this business, I never talked to payers. Now I spend as much time with payers as I do with patent attorneys. And it's pushing to innovation and it's pushing to cure versus, smaller quality, not smaller, but quality of life issues. So then you get to the hard part, we haven't worked out how this $1 million therapy is going to get paid for. In venture, you have to kind of make decisions on imperfect information and, the future. It's kind of like the the Samuel Golden quote, predictions, particularly about the future, are dangerous, right? So, I mean, I'm not 100% sure how they're going to work out the $1 million payment for a cure. I do know it's an innovative cure that makes a large impact, and from a societal standpoint is cost effective. So, you don't want to be lackadaisical about it. At the same time, if you have the prediction for all the economic model to get a cure paid for 10 years out, you might be fooling yourself as well. So we're just making the decisions on imperfect information.
One more anecdote. So I didn't really join venture capital out of high school, and one of my previous jobs was at Genzyme. And I remember a very senior person from Genzyme making the flippant remark, who are we kidding? We're more of a lobbying organization than we are a scientific one. And that was a cynical thing to say, but in reality, there were certain companies that really led the way towards $200,000 prices or $300,000. Those were outrageous prices back in the day. And Henry Tremere and that organization did a lot of the heavy lifting. And so what I've been looking for is who are the companies that are going to help us solve these pricing problems and these cure issues going forward. It'll be leadership companies, or it'll be the entrepreneurial system organically figuring it out. But I think we all believe first principles. If you're doing something important for therapeutically, it will get paid for.
Yeah, and that's certainly what was driving Henry to think about the patient first and deliver something, and then figure out. And that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what you guys are doing for your investment. That's what we're doing when we in-license or buy a compound. We don't know, especially in cures, how we are going to finally price it. We hope that the right innovation is going to be priced fairly.
Is it safe to say, though, that you're having that pricing discussion with them, and have they thought about the price? Have they thought about how it's going to be paid for? Have they thought about the reimbursement and coverage? And you're expecting something coherent.
When we're making the investment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and more biotech CEOs are thinking about that. As we all said, I mean, nobody has the answer, so especially in terms of cures, but they know that, the goal in the past was regulatory approval. Now that's not the goal. The goal is, can I get a price that makes sense? And they need to start thinking about that very early.
Maybe on that, I think on our experience, we've seen not that many biotech having really thought through all this pricing and access aspect. So it's been a lot about the clinical data or the scientific data, and then making some kind of slides, linking that with some price somewhere of something that has no relevance whatsoever, and saying just multiplying that by the number of patients. So I'm sorry to say that that's very often what we see.
It's often, investors need a $500 million or $1 billion market, so here's the number of patients, and here's the price I need to justify that market. It's that sophisticated. So my hunch is, Alice, that you've had more sophisticated conversations with biotech CEOs, because I'm starting preclinically, right? So we have a conversation about number of patients, what price would get you there, and so on. But we're not thinking about whether or not there's going to be rebates and how you're going to spread the payments over 5 years.
We certainly think it's a good thing to be thinking about that early, realizing that it's still very far out, but it can be in the licensing context where which indication are you licensing and what is its value, what are you keeping? Is it a product that's going to be used in combination with another product all the time, some of the time? That's going to impact the pricing. One of the topics that I wanted us to talk about also on the investment decision is, do you look at what gets approved first? How do you stage it? Because we've had a little bit of that conversation here already, particularly when we don't yet have indication-based pricing. Are people thinking about that? If not, you should be, because in at least the U.S. market, the way you price it when you launch it, you might be stuck with that forever. And so if the higher value indication comes out later, you might not be able to adjust the price for that.
Yeah, so as an example, young companies, science-based or early clinical-based companies, tend to be really focused on technical risk, on clinical risk, and often will almost mortgage commercial risk in exchange. So they'll come up with the cleverest way to thread the needle to get to approval, but get a label that would not justify the bigger market or the bigger price, and in effect mortgage the product. And so that is a frequent conversation that we have. In fact, I just had a conversation like that this morning about a product that's not a cure, but it's super cool. They've got a very clever way to get to market, and that's what the team's focused on. But the product will very likely have an enormous mortality benefit. And I was talking to, it's in dialysis space, a big dialysis player about, would it be possible once we had this narrow label to expand out?
Absolutely. We look at either first to market or best of breed. You can be second or third if you're best of breed. If you're a me too and second or third, those days are over. They were good while they lasted for some companies, but I haven't seen that.
Maybe
recently.
two other aspects that we don't see in some of the biotech proposal there, in terms of their clinical development, they don't look at the cost of like hospitalization cost, the induced cost by the therapy or that are happening in standard of care. So they miss opportunities there in looking at the overall cost structure and what their drugs can do there. And the other aspect is quality of life. I know that this is a concept that is now not very much in fashion, but the reality is that how they change their drugs, changing the life of the patient, comes back to the willingness to pay that you mentioned about the wrinkles in the US. But how is that going to change the life of the patients? And these two aspects I don't see often in the business analysis coming from the biotech companies.
Well, speaking on behalf of biotech companies everywhere, I know that we deeply think about the reimbursement challenge, but for us it's a slightly different issue. Ideally, we don't have the overhead. That means that we carry a big, giant burden into the commercialization plan that we're then looking to justify across the portfolio of a wide variety of programs, but are looking really at a single program. So this question of speed to market, does speed to market make sense, or should you focus on peak sales? That should be a strategic discussion that companies have early on, because if you said you had first mover advantage by following an indication where I'll be the first drug to launch in the category, it can be a substantial advantage over doing a heavier lift on a longer term outcome. And really on cure, it's the question of how well established is the regulatory path. I'm sure all of us can think of in the last year situations where the FDA was wrestling with whether the data demonstrated in a unique disease area was sufficiently robust to justify approval, or whether a different data set for a longer period of time would have made a different sense. And in that case, the drug was approved with a little bit of controversy. But if you said, on speed to market, how solid is the development path? What's the likelihood of regulatory engagement? And if there's other patient-based outcomes that are useful, are those additions to the label that are de-risked because at the time I'm investing in those, I'm already on the market as a commercial company, or am I investing up front? Because in a big pharma model, we do it all well in advance of approval because there's a bigger balance sheet. So for biotech, it's a little bit more. If I do a speed to market strategy, how well laid is the regulatory path? If there is a patient outcome that's going to change reimbursement, what's the timing to do that? So I've de-risked the program enough to know that that investment will return back on an approved product. So it's a slightly different question.
I just want to make sure people are making purposeful decisions, right? The concern I have in advising companies is, are you triangulating all of those bits of information about the regulatory pathway, what the price will be, the coverage and payment profile, and realizing the different combinations you have and making a purposeful decision as opposed to ending up in something because you haven't done that? I think that's what you just want to make sure you're thinking about as you're evaluating the indications, the clinical trials, the parameters, what the label will look like, the disease state, and the like.
I can tell you, earlier this year with Radius Health, with the launch of our first product, Timlos, one of the questions that came into play was for patients on Medicare, which of course was the vast majority of the elderly patient population. What is the out-of-price cost at which they can afford medication? And where is the point where the out-of-pocket payment means that they don't fill the script and it's not possible? Now, for many of these retired individuals, as soon as you get to $300, $400, $500 a month, you're now exceeding ability to pay, not necessarily willingness, but ability to pay. So if you think of this concept of responsible pricing, when patients are in a reimbursement metric, which means they have a responsibility to carry a portion of the costs, Right now, based on the way the laws are structured, sometimes it's difficult for industry to offset those costs for them. So one choice would be, can we change the laws so that when people need economic support to afford medication, it's not an inducement for use? I'm confident most patients facing the need for chemotherapy would not be more likely to use it because someone helped them pay their costs. I mean, I think there's a policy question there about how can we help patients with their copay. As an industry player, I think we have a responsibility to thinking of when is that out-of-pocket exceeding ability to pay, and if that's the case, how do we then come up with an innovative model to work more closely with the payer, like Express Scripts, do an outcomes payment, or a way that helps make it so the patients can still get access. I mean, we're developing the medicines because our goal is to have people use them and benefit, but we have to solve the economic challenge.
So I just want to make sure we have some questions left, time for questions, but the last question I'm going to ask is to you, Pascal, because you are in this unique situation of having brought a cure to the market where you actually worked with the, in some ways, most cumbersome payer of them all, which is CMS. And so, we've focused a lot on talking to private payers, but Medicare and Medicaid drive a lot of that. And so is there anything that you can tell us about that experience or lessons learned or suggestions you would have based on that experience?
Yeah, maybe a few lessons. First of all, that when we had a few ideas internally, all the experts tell us that this is not possible. So I think first is not listen to the experts. That's the first thing. And then think about your idea, and we wanted really to find solution for access there. And we have been able to do something, but not everything we wanted to do. And there are aspects related to the system in the US, especially the DRG system, that creates a very slow possibility of accessing innovation that requires hospital cost because of the way the hospitals are being reimbursed there. So this, we were not able to change the system there, that's for sure. But at least we've been able to progressively make some changes and find solutions there. So this has been really a good lesson not to consider that things are as they are and you can change things. And CMS was indeed and still is ready to listen and find solutions there. The fact that we started for pediatric ALL was certainly an advantage there. It was not a decision, it was just based on when the data were available and when we could start the studies, but it was an advantage because they are a small population. It's extremely important for anybody. I mean, I don't know any payers that will reject, at the end of the day, really access to treatment for a kid that might die in the next few months if he doesn't get that treatment there. Even though we still had some challenges, and we have some challenges in terms of having some state Medicaid rejecting or telling, okay, we reimbursed zero, which we saw one letter like that, so it was quite interesting. But what we had put in place is an access program. So for those extreme cases, we've been able to pay for that ourselves at Novartis, and that was part of the business case, that we knew that there will be a few cases where the payers will, despite all the evidence and the fact that it's only a small number of patients, will not lead to a timely access. Because time is important in these kids, so you cannot wait 6 months to get an approval of the coverage there. You need to find a solution right now. So it was important also from the beginning to put that in place, an access program that could take care of these kids that were not having the coverage immediately from the payers there.
You're building on the DRG hospital point. I've interviewed people who run pharmacy in hospitals and as part of doing diligence in general. And I've always been amazed that they're paid and bonused on saving pharmaceutical costs, not on overall patient costs. And until that changes, I don't know how we really get sort of big picture thinking within hospital.
On that note, I do think we have a few questions from the audience.
There were a few questions from the audience that came in relatively early, and I think we've covered quite a bit of it around gene therapy, around the difference between the US and international markets. There's one here that was around the role of internal optimization of value-based pricing and whether there is waste hiding behind such pricing. I don't know if anyone wants to address that.
Could you repeat the questions?
The role of internal optimization of value-based pricing and how much waste there's hiding behind such pricing.
I don't actually understand the question.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure.
Do you, Alice?
I'm just wondering if the idea is that value-based pricing, covers hidden costs that shouldn't be paid for in some sort of way, that the way you value the product, but I'm inferring what that is. But it just goes back to how do you price it to begin with, and that's going to cover, it could be healthcare economics, it could be costs, it could be a lot of different reference points for that. Cammie, you asked a question early on about why so much focus on value-based pricing now. I will say value and outcomes-based pricing, because I've done this for a while, has been around for a long time. I remember it being with some of the osteoporosis products around, guaranteeing that hospitalization costs for hip fractures, for a health plan, would remain, at a certain level. So there was some of that, but not. What has changed is the level of discount or the money-back guarantee component. That's what's different. There are some changes in the regulatory scheme that have enabled manufacturers to do that in a way that doesn't kill their pricing to the government. But I think it's a combination of that change and price pressure.
So scrutiny and then the absolute price of cures sound like two of the reasons.
Right, and some development in the regulatory schemes where actually you can go into CMS and talk to them about a way to do that, and they're willing to have that conversation with you. That you definitely now have in the market manufacturers that are basically saying money back guarantee, or you don't pay. Either you don't pay at all in the case of Kymriah, or you get your money back. I've seen arrangements where if there's a decent amount of population that comes off a drug after they try it because of adverse events or whatever, refunding that amount to the payer. I've seen that. So there is a lot more of that now, and I think part of that is some regulatory flexibility and the government being willing to have those discussions to try to make it happen.
There was a question around which diseases have the most high unmet medical need from an investor point of view, and what you were interested in, maybe in the context of the question of cure being addressed more. Is that changing?
I'm so far not lacking for unmet medical needs to invest in, and I would say for little companies, for startup companies, probably the bigger challenge for us, if you're starting all the way back at preclinical stages, would be it makes the most sense to fail fast, and so certain therapeutic areas are where you don't actually know whether or not your therapy works until very late in clinical development, after hundreds of millions of dollars in the ground, are harder. They're not untouchable, but they're harder for venture capitalists to invest in. Having said that, Alzheimer's is one of those, and Denali just had lots of money go into it and a big IPO and so on. So again, never say never. We are not investors in Denali, but those sorts of therapeutic areas, and a lot of them are incredibly clinically important and major unmet needs, are harder for young companies.
Yeah, I mean, Alzheimer's, obesity, diabetes, huge cost to society, huge cost across the world. That doesn't necessarily mean it's optimal for venture capital investing the way it's structured in America today. But, I agree with Cam, there's tons of unmet need out there across all sorts of diseases.
But could I ask then, from an investment perspective, just taking Alzheimer's as an example, if you were confident that there was an approvable endpoint that had regulatory traction and you had reason to believe that the mechanism of action could work on that approvable endpoint, would that change your thinking about Alzheimer's?
Yes, and I would say something else. So last year, for me, one of the themes coming out of JP Morgan was genetically defined cancers, right? So people are now talking about genetically defined other diseases, including CNS disorders. So if whatever we can do to improve PTS and to improve information content earlier in clinical development makes it easier to invest in as an early stage investor.
Okay, great. The other questions were either very specific, or we would have another 2 hours of discussion, I think. So thank you very much for this great discussion. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we're just at the beginning of really answering that question around how cures are going to be priced. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.